The courtroom smelled like polished wooden and cheap cologne, a mix that made my stomach churn. As I stepped inside, I adjusted my tie borrowed from a coworker because I didn't own one and scanned the room there. She was 2 rows ahead, her dark hair pulled into a sleek bon, the familiar smirk playing on her lips. My wife sat next to a lawyer who looked like he charged by the syllable, his suit sharper than the betrayal I'd been carrying for months. Her mother was there too, perched like a vulture in her pearl necklace, whispering just loud enough for me to catch it. They'll try to gild her again, watch. I wanted to shout to tell them all how wrong they were, but I kept my mouth shut. My hands gripped the folder in my lap, the edges worn from nights spent staring at it, wondering if I had the guts to use what was inside 10 years. That's how long I'd poured everything into her dream, her wellness studios that now dotted the city like glittering trophies. I'd worked 3 jobs to make it happen, hauling concrete at construction sites, running delivery routes until midnight, and designing logos on a cracked laptop until my eyes burned. Also, she could have her empire, and now she sat there laughing with the crowd as she called me a leech. "He doesn't even have a real job," she said, her voice light like she was tossing out a joke at a dinner party. The room chuckled and I felt the heat crawl up my neck. I wasn't here to play the victim, though I wasn't here to beg. I'd spent a decade building something with her, believing we were a team. But the second, her studios started pulling in millions, I became invisible. Worse than invisible, a liability. She'd rewritten our story, turned me into some deadbeat who'd just tagged along for the ride. The judge banged his gavel and the room quieted. My lawyer, a guy I could barely afford, leaned over and muttered, "You ready?" I nodded, but my eyes stayed on her. She didn't even glance my way, too busy whispering to her attorney, probably planning how to spin this to her followers. Online wellness guru fights off greedy ex would make a great headline, wouldn't it? But I wasn't greedy. I wasn't even angry, not anymore. I was tired of being erased, tired of pretending I hadn't given up everything for her. The folder in my hands felt heavier than it should have, like it carried the weight of all those years. Inside was one sheet of paper, one signature, one promise she'd forgotten, but I never would. I'd found it in a storage box a month ago, buried under old tax returns and sketches. I'd drawn for her first studio's logo back when we were just 2 kids in love, dreaming big over instant noodles. The judge called my name and my throat tightened. This was it. I stood my legs steady, despite the nerves buzzing through me. The room watched, waiting for me to fumble to prove her right. But I wasn't leaving this courtroom empty-handed. Not today. I handed the folder to my lawyer, who gave me a small nod like he knew what this moment meant, as he walked toward the judge's bench. I caught her mother's eye. She looked smug, certain I was about to embarrass myself. Let her think that. Let them all think that. I sat back down, my heart pounding. But my mind clear, the paper in that folder wasn't just a contract. It was proof. Proof of what I'd given, what I'd built, what I deserved. The lawyer handed it to the judge, and I watched her face for the first time since I'd walked in. Her smirk faltered just for a second, like she. Since something was coming, she didn't know what yet, but she would. Soon, everyone in this room would. I leaned back in my chair, the noise of the courtroom fading into a dole hum for the first time in years. I felt like I was in control, not of her, not of the studios, but of my own story. And today, I was going to start telling it. 10 years ago, our life was small but full, squeezed into a 1-bedroom apartment in Queens that smelled faintly of mildew and takeout. I can still picture it, the sagging couch we'd scored off the curb, the tiny kitchen table where we'd sit with mugs of instant coffee, dreaming up a future that felt just out of reach. My hands were rough from hauling lumber at construction sites all day. My nights spent hunched over an old laptop piecing together her website, pixel by pixel. I'd deliver pizzas until midnight, weaving through traffic with her voice in my head, promising me we were building something real one day. You'll own part of it too. She'd say, her eyes bright as we collapsed onto our mattress, ramen bowls balanced on our chests. I believed her not because I needed the money or the credit, but because I loved her. Back then, she wasn't a woman who dragged me to court to erase me from her story, or at least I didn't think she was. I'd come home from a 12-hour shift, my boots caked with mud, and find her sketching floor plans for her first wellness studio. She'd talk fast words, tumbling out about yoga classes and smoothie bars, her hands waving like she could already see it. I listened, nodding, already calculating how many extra delivery runs I'd need to cover the rent, while we saved for her dream. I didn't mind her passion, lit something in me, made the ache in my back, and the blisters on my hands feel worth it. I'd spend my breaks at the construction site calling suppliers for her, haggling over prices for yoga mats and mirrors. At night, I designed flyers, tweaking fonts until my vision blurred. Every paycheck I earned, whether from swinging a hammer, dropping off pizzas, or freelancing logos, went straight into our joint account. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt like we were a team, like every late-night talk. And every dollar saved was a brick and something bigger. I remember the day we signed the lease for her first studio. The landlord was a grumpy guy with a cigar habit, and he kept eyeing me like I was the one who'd flake on the rent. I didn't care. I handed over the deposit. Every cent I'd scraped together from my uncle's old truck I'd sold, and watched her face light up as she held the keys. That night, we celebrated with cheap wine and takeout, sitting cross-legged on the apartment floor. She leaned against me, her hair tickling my chin, and said, "We did this together." I felt like I could have run through a wall for her. Those early days weren't easy. The studio bled money at first. People didn't exactly flock to a non-ain yoga spot in a strip mall. I took on extra shifts at a gas station to cover the losses, pumping fuel and mopping floors while she taught classes to half-empty rooms. I'd stop by after work, still in my work, boots to fix a leaky pipe or hang shelf she'd bought on clearance. Customers would give me side glances, probably wondering why the handyman was always there. I didn't care. I was proud of her, proud of us. When the studio finally turned a profit, we threw a little party. Just us, her 2 instructors, and a playlist. Blaring from my cracked phone. She grabbed my hand and pulled me into a dance, laughing like we'd cracked some secret code to the universe. I thought that was it, the start of something permanent. I didn't see the shift coming. Maybe I should have. Maybe I was too busy working too, caught up in keeping her dream alive to notice the way her smile started to fade when she looked at me back then. I didn't know how fast love could turn into something else, something colder, sharper. All I knew was that I'd give her everything. I had every hour, every dollar, every ounce of faith, and for a while it felt like enough. I'd lie awake at night, her breathing soft beside me, and think about how far we'd come. From that tiny apartment to a studio with her name on the sign. I didn't need my name up there. I didn't need anyone to know what I'd done. I just needed her to remember, and for a while I thought she would. The change didn't happen all at once. It crept in slow, like damp rot in a wall. You don't notice until the whole thing's crumbling. I'd been so focused on keeping her dream afloat, I didn't see the cracks forming between us. It started when her 3rd studio opened a sleek spot in Manhattan that drew in influencers and corporate types with too much money. Suddenly, our life wasn't just about yoga and smoothies anymore. It was about branding and optics, and that's when her mother slid into our world, like she'd been waiting for her cue. Judith had always been around, dropping by our old apartment once or twice a year, with her pursed lips and her perfume that stung my nose. But back then, she'd kept her distance, maybe because we were too broke for her to bother meddling. Now with the studios pulling in real cash, she was a regular fixture, her heels clicking. I'd come home from a construction shift, my clothes dusted with dirt, and find her sipping tea at our kitchen counter, eyeing me like I was something the cat dragged in. "You should dress better," she'd say, not even looking up from her phone. "People talk, I'd shrug it off, too tired to argue, but it stung. I wasn't some polished guy with a degree or a corner office, and I never pretended to be. I was the guy who'd built her daughter's empire with my hands and my husty, and I thought that was enough. But Judith had other ideas. I overheard her one night, her voice sharp as she sat with my wife in the living room. "He'll hold you back," she said, like I was a dead weight instead of the one wiring every paycheck into those studios. "You're a brand. Now you need to think about who you're seen with." I stood in the hallway, my work boots still on, and felt something twist in my chest. I waited for my wife to defend me, to tell her mother she was wrong, but she didn't. She just murmured something I couldn't catch, and that silence hit harder than any insult. From then on, things shifted. My wife started going to events without me. glass networking mixers, places where I'd stick out in my flannel and jeans. She'd come home late, her laughter lighter than it had been in years, talking about investors and partnerships. I'd ask how it went, and she'd give me a quick smile like she was humoring me before disappearing into her phone. I noticed she stopped wearing her wedding ring around that time. "It's just easier," she said when I asked, her voice casual like she was talking about switching shampoo. Some clients assume I'm more approachable if I'm not flashing a ring. I didn't push it, but I felt the ground slipping under me. I kept working, though. Construction by day, deliveries at night, freelance gigs when I could squeeze them in the studios were thriving. And I was still the one handling the grunt work behind the scenes, fixing plumbing at the Brooklyn location, sourcing cheaper vendors for the juice bar, even painting walls when a new spot opened. But I wasn't her partner anymore. I was her employee, one she didn't even acknowledge. At home, our conversations dwindled to logistics schedules, bills, nothing real. She'd talk about the brand like it was a living thing more important than us. One night, she came back from some fancy dinner and dropped it. "It's better for the brand if people think I'm single." She said it like it was no big deal, like she was asking me to pick up milk. I stood there, my hands still smelling of paint from the studio. I touched up that morning and stared at her. "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice low. She shrugged, already scrolling through her phone. "It's just business. You get it, but I didn't get it. I didn't get how the woman who'd once danced with me in our tiny apartment could look at me like I was nothing." Judith's words echoed in my head, "He'll hold you back." And I realized my wife believed them. Now I was invisible in the empire I'd built with my blood and sweat, and worse. I was starting to feel invisible in my own life. I lay awake at night, her breathing steady beside me, and wondered where I'd gone wrong. Had I loved her too much, worked too hard, or had I just been too blind to see? She'd outgrown me. All I knew was that the dream we'd started together wasn't mine anymore. And maybe I was starting to think neither was she. It was a Thursday when my world tilted. I was restocking nails and screws in the hardware store's aisle. 7, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead when a guy in a cheap suit walked up. He didn't say much, just asked my name, shoved an envelope into my hands, and left without a backward glance. I stood there, a box of drywall screws still in my grip, staring at the envelope like it might bite me. I knew what it was before I even opened it. The weight of it. The way my gut-twisted divorce papers don't feel like regular mail. I stuffed it into my back pocket and kept working, my hands moving on autopilot while my mind spun. I didn't open it until my break, sitting in the stockroom on a crate, the hum of the store muffled through the walls. The words blurred at first. Dissolution of marriage. No alimony, no asset, split. Then taped to the last page, a handwritten note in her familiar scroll. "For my lawyers. Advice. You have no legal claim to the business." I read it twice, then laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so absurd. I didn't know what else to do. 10 years of pouring my life into her studios, every paycheck, every late night, every callus on my hands, and she thought she could erase me with a pen and a lawyer. I folded the papers, slid them back into the envelope, and finished my shift. The guy buying lumber at the register probably thought I was nuts, smiling like I just went to bed instead of losing my marriage. But I wasn't smiling because I was happy, I was smiling because I remembered something she didn't. That night, I drove to the storage locker I'd rented years ago, a damn little unit crammed with boxes. We'd never unpacked after moving. I hadn't been there in ages, but I knew exactly what I was looking for. Under a stack of old tax returns and sketchbooks filled with logo drafts for her first studio. I found it a single folder, edges yellowed but intact. Inside was a contract signed and notarized 9 years ago, back when we were still a team. She'd needed $75,000 to secure the lease for her first location, and I'd handed it over without a second thought, every cent of the inheritance. My uncle left me when he passed. I'd never seen that money as mine, not really. It was just another way to help her dream come true. In return, she'd promised me a 35% equity stake in the business. Her signature was there, bold and looping next. I sat on the concrete floor of that locker, the contract in my hands, and let the weight of it settle over me. She'd forgotten about it, buried it under her success, her new life, her mother's whispers about how I wasn't good enough, but I hadn't forgotten. I'd kept it not because I'd planned to use it against her, but because back then it felt like a piece of us, a promise we'd made together. I drove home with the folder on the passenger seat, the city lights streaking past like they were racing me to some finish line. I couldn't see my apartment. Our apartment, though it hadn't felt like ours in months, was quiet when I got in. Her stuff was still there, designer bags and yoga mats cluttering the corners, but she wasn't probably at some event. Smiling for photos while her lawyer prepped the next move to cut me out, I poured a glass of water, sat at the kitchen table, and read the contract again. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the years I'd given her hauling lumber, delivering pizzas, designing her brand while she slept. It was about the nights I'd stayed up, balancing our budget so she could focus on teaching classes. It was about the man I'd been thinking love was enough to hold us together. I didn't want to destroy her. I didn't even want to hurt her, not really. But I wasn't going to let her rewrite me out of my own life. That contract was my proof, my anchor, the one thing she couldn't spin into a story that made me the villain. I tucked it into a drawer, locked it, and went to bed for the first time in months. I slept through the night, no dreams, no tossing. The envelope from the courier sat on the counter unanswered. Let her think I was broken. Let her think I'd sign and walk away. I wasn't signing anything yet. I had something she didn't expect, something she'd underestimated, just like she'd underestimated me, and I was going to use it not to take what was hers, but to reclaim what was mine. I wasn't the kind of guy who knew lawyers, not the way my wife did with her Rolodex of slick suits, who probably golf her with judges. My world was hardware stores and construction sites, not conference rooms and contracts. So when I walked into Camille Rivas's office, a cramped little space above a deli in Brooklyn, I felt out of place like a stray dog wandering into a boutique. The walls were lined with books, and a single plant sat wilting in the corner. But her desk was tidy, stacked with folders and a thermos that smelled faintly of coffee. She was younger than I'd expected. Maybe. Early 30s with sharp eyes and a handshake that meant business. I'd found her through a coworker who'd said she's small-time, but Fierce helped my cousin keep his house when his ex tried to clean him out. That was enough for me. I needed someone who'd fight, not just cash my checks. I sat across from her, the contract from the storage locker in my hands, and told her everything. 10 years of work, the studios, the divorce papers, my wife's note claiming I had no stake in her empire. My voice stayed steady, but my fingers kept folding and unfolding the edge of the folder. Betraying the knots in my chest, Camille listened, jolting notes on a legal pad, her face unreadable until I slid the contract across the desk. She picked it up, scanned it, and raised an eyebrow. Did she really forget this existed? She asked, her tone somewhere between disbelief and amusement. I nodded, leaning back in the creaky chair. She forgot a lot of things. Camille's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but close. She read the contract again, slower, this time her finger tracing the lines about the $75,000 I'd invested and the 35% equity stake I'd been promised. The notary seal was still crisp, the signature's mine and my wife's undeniable. This is solid, she said, setting it down, not just solid ironclad. She signed it. You've got the receipts and it's legally binding. For the first time in weeks. I felt my shoulders loosen like I'd been carrying a bag of cement and someone had finally taken it off my back. I'd spent so long doubting myself, wondering if I was crazy for thinking I deserved a piece of what I'd built. But hearing her say it, seeing the certainty in her eyes, made it real. Camille leaned forward, her voice low but firm. You're not taking from her. You're taking back what's already yours. She might have the money and the lawyers, but you've got the truth, and this she tapped the contract. The question is, how far do you want to go with it? I didn't answer, right away. Part of me wanted to storm into court, wave that paper in everyone's faces and watch my wife smirk, vanish. But another part, the part that still remembered her laughing with me over cheap wine 10 years ago, just wanted this to be over, to walk away without a fight. I rubbed my jaw, the stubble rough under my fingers, and thought about the man I'd been back then. I'd given her everything, not because I wanted a reward, but because I believed in us now. She was trying to erase me, and I couldn't let that stand. I want what's fair, I said. Finally. I don't need to ruin her, but I'm not letting her walk over me anymore. Camille nodded, like she'd expected that answer. There's what will get you, maybe more. She pulled out a notepad and started listing next steps, gathering bank records, pulling emails, tracking down anything that showed how much I'd poured into the studios. They'll try to paint you as a freeloader. She warned her team's going to come hard, make it personal. You ready for that? I thought about the courtroom, the way my wife's mother had sneered, the way the crowd had laughed when she called me a leech. I'd spent years swallowing my pride, staying quiet while her world outgrew me. I wasn't doing that again. I'm ready, I said, and I meant it. Camille didn't promise me a win, didn't sugarcoat it. She just laid out the plan. We'd file a counterclaim, demand my equity based on the contract, and show the court exactly how much I'd contributed. It's not just about the money, she said. As I stood to leave, it's about making sure she can't rewrite your story. I shook her hand, feeling steadier than I had in months. Outside the city hummed horns, blaring people, rushing past like they all had somewhere important to be. I didn't have much, not anymore. No fancy house, no big bank account, just a beat-up truck, and a job that left my hands rough. But I had Camille now, and I had that contract for the first time since those divorce papers hit my hands. I felt like I wasn't fighting alone. I drove home the folder on the seat beside me and let myself imagine walking into court with something to say. Not out of anger, not out of spite, but because I'd earned it because I wasn't invisible anymore. The courtroom felt different this time, like the air itself was holding its breath. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my tie still borrowed, but pressed my hands steady on the polished wood. Across the room. My wife was a storm of confidence, her hair perfect, her suit tailored to scream success. She leaned toward her lawyer, whispering her eyes, darting to me once sharp and cold before, flicking away. Her mother sat behind her pearls, gleaming, muttering, something that made the people nearby smirk. I caught the words pathetic and desperate, and my jaw tightened, but I didn't flinch. I'd spent too many years swallowing their poison to let it get to me now. Camille sat beside me, her notepad open, her calm, like a shield I could lean into. She'd warned me this would be rough, that my wife's team would come out swinging, aiming to bury me before I could even stand, and they did. Her lawyer, a guy with a voice like he was selling luxury cars, stood and painted me as a Lee who'd coasted on her brilliance. He's bitter, he said, pacing for the jury, a man who couldn't keep up with her ambition, now trying to claw his way into her success. He called me financial deadweight in the room, rippled with murmurs. I felt the eyes on me, judging, assuming he was right. My wife nodded along her face, a mask of pity like she felt sorry for me. It was a performance, and she was good at it. Always had been. Always. Judith leaned forward, whispering to the woman next to her, loud enough for me to hear so embarrassing. I wanted to stand up to shout that I'd build her empire with my sweat and sacrifice. But Camille's hand brushed my arm, a quiet reminder to stay steady. We'd have our turn. The judge, an older guy with a face like weathered stone, watched it all without a word, his pen scratching notes. When my wife's lawyer finally sat, Camille stood, her movements deliberate, like she was setting up a chessboard. She didn't raise her voice. Didn't need to, Your Honor, she said. We'd like to submit evidence that tells a different story. My heart kicked up a notch as she walked to the bench, the contract in her hands. I'd handed it to her that morning, the paper still carrying the faint, musty smell of the storage locker. She placed it before the judge, then turned to face the room. This is a signed, notarized agreement from 9 years ago, when my client invested $75,000, his entire inheritance, into the first of the wellness studios in exchange. He was granted a 35% equity stake in the business. Legally binding, never revoked. The room, shifted whispers spread like static, and I saw my wife's face freeze, her eyes narrowing as she leaned toward her lawyer, whispering furiously. He looked caught off guard, flipping through his notes like he'd missed something vital. Judith's mouth tightened, her pearls suddenly, less smock. I kept my gaze forward, but inside I felt a spark of something I hadn't in years. Control. Camille wasn't done. She called me to the stand, and I walked up, my boots heavy on the floor. I swore to tell the truth, my voice steady despite the eyes boring into me. She asked me to explain what I'd done for the studios, and I didn't hold back. I talked. About the construction jobs I'd worked to fund, the first lease, the delivery routes I'd run to cover, rent the nights I'd spent designing logos and flyers while my wife slept. I told them how I'd fixed pipes, hung mirrors, negotiated with vendors. All of it unpaid, all of it because I believed in her dream. My voice didn't waver, but my throat tightened when I said I didn't do it for credit. I did it because I thought we were building something together. The room was quiet now. No murmurs, no smirks. Camille asked me about the $75,000 and I explained how it came from my uncle's estate, how I'd handed it over without a second thought because I trusted her. I looked at my wife in just for a second and saw something flicker in her eyes. Guilt, maybe, or just shocked that I wasn't the pushover she'd counted on. Her lawyer tried to rattle me on cross-examination, asking why I'd waited so long to suddenly claim my stake. "You never mentioned this contract before," he said, his tone dripping with doubt. I leaned into the mic and said I didn't think I'd need to. I trusted her to remember what we built. He didn't have much to say after that. When I stepped down, Camille gave me a small nod, her eyes saying we'd landed a hit. My wife's team scrambled their confidence, cracking like thin ice. Her lawyer stood again, trying to spin the contract as a misunderstanding, claiming it was outdated, irrelevant, but the judge wasn't buying it. He held the paper up, his voice dry as he said, "This looks pretty clear to me." I sat back at the table, my pulse steady now. The room that had laughed at me weeks ago was silent, the air thick with a new kind of tension. My wife wouldn't meet my eyes, her hands twisting in her lap. Judith sat rigid, her whispers gone for the first time. I felt, seen not as the loser they'd painted, but as the man who'd built something real. Camille leaned over, her voice low. "We've got them on their heels. This isn't over yet." I nodded my hands, uncle clenching. I wasn't here to destroy anyone. I was here to stand up to show I wasn't invisible. And right then, with that contract on the judge's desk, I knew I'd done it. The courtroom had a different pulse now, like the tide had turned and everyone could feel it. I sat at the table, my hands resting on the wood, no longer gripping the edges like I was holding on for dear life. Across the room, my wife's face was a mask, but I could see the cracks, her jaw tight, her eyes darting to her lawyer like he was supposed to pull a miracle out of his briefcase. Her mother sat behind her stiff as a statue, her usual muttering silenced by the weight of what had just happened. The contract I'd pulled from that dusty storage locker had changed everything, and Camille wasn't about to let the momentum slip. She stood, her voice clear and steady, and started laying out the rest of our case piece by piece, like she was building a house no one could tear down. I'd spent the last week digging through old files, bank statements, anything I could find to back up what I'd said on the stand. Camille had warned me her team would try to twist the truth, make it look like I was some opportunist chasing her money. So we'd come prepared, armed with proof that showed exactly how much I'd given to those studios. She started with the bank transfers, projecting them on a screen for the judge and jury to see every month. For years, my paychecks from construction deliveries, freelance gigs had gone straight into our joint account, the same one that funded her first location. "These aren't loans," Camille said, pointing to the numbers. "These are contributions made without expectation of repayment, because my client believed he was investing in a shared future." The judge nodded slightly, his pen moving across his notepad, and I felt a flicker of hope. My wife's lawyer tried to interrupt, claiming the transfers were just household expenses. But Camille didn't flinch. She pulled up emails next, ones I'd sent to vendors in the early days, negotiating deals for yoga mats and lighting fixtures while I was on my lunch break at a construction site. One email from me to her read, "Got the mirrors for half price, should be up by Saturday." I remembered writing it, my hands dusty from hauling lumber, thinking I was doing something good for us. Seeing it now blown up on a screen in front of strangers made my chest ache, not from sadness, but from the clarity of how much I'd carried. The jury leaned forward, their faces shifting from bored to curious. Camille kept going, her voice never wavering. She showed text messages where I'd coordinated with contractors to fix leaks at the Brooklyn studio, photos of me painting walls at the Manhattan location, even a staff roster I'd helped put together when her first manager quit. "This wasn't a bystander," she said, turning to the judge. "This was a partner in every sense of the word." I glanced at my wife, then expecting her to look angry or defiant, but her eyes were fixed on the floor, her hands twisting in her lap for a second. I wondered if she felt it the weight of what she'd tried to erase, but I didn't linger on it. This wasn't about her anymore. This was about me, about making sure the truth stood taller than her story, the real. Blow came when Camille called her accountant to the stand. He was a nervous guy, glasses slipping down his nose, clearly not thrilled to be there. She asked him about the initial investor listed in the studio's financial records, the one who'd put in $75,000 to start it all. He fidgeted, glancing at my wife's lawyer, but under oath he couldn't lie. The investor was never removed from the books. He admitted the name was just changed in later reports. Camille didn't miss a beat change to what she asked. He swallowed hard. It was listed as an anonymous contribution. She pressed him, and he confirmed. What I'd known all along, that anonymous investor was me. My $75,000 still sitting at the heart of her empire, never repaid, never acknowledged. The courtroom went dead, quiet. The kind of silence that feels like it's pressing against your skin. Even the judge stopped writing, his eyes narrowing as he looked at my wife's team, her lawyer. Stood stammering about clerical errors, but it was too late. The jury wasn't buying it, and neither was I. Camille sat down beside me, her expression calm, but her eyes sharp with satisfaction. "They're unraveling," she whispered. I nodded, my throat tight. I'd spent so long feeling invisible, like my work. My sacrifice had been buried under her success, but now, piece by piece, it was coming to light. The jury saw it, the judge saw it, and whether she admitted it or not, my wife saw it too. Her mother hadn't said a word since the accountant's testimony. Her face pale, her pearls no longer a shield. The room that had laughed at me weeks ago, that had eaten up her story of me as a deadbeat, was different. Now the murmurs weren't mocking anymore. They were questions, doubts, maybe even respect. I didn't need their applause or their pity. I just needed them to see the truth. I wasn't the man she painted. I was the one who'd laid the foundation for everything she had, and I wasn't going to let her pretend otherwise. When the judge called a recess, Camille turned to me, her voice low. "We've got them on the ropes, you okay?" I nodded, again feeling steadier than I had in years. The courtroom emptied around us, but I stayed in my seat for a moment, letting the silence settle. I wasn't fighting for revenge or even for money. Not really, I was fighting for the man. I'd been the one who'd believed in her, who'd given everything, who deserved to be remembered. And right then, with the truth laid bare, I felt like he was finally standing tall. The courtroom felt smaller now, like the walls had closed in, trapping the truth in a space where it couldn't be ignored. I sat at the table, my hands folded, watching the judge as he leafed through his notes. His face gave nothing away, but the air was heavy, charged with the fallout of everything Camille had laid out: bank transfers, emails, the accountant's testimony. That contract I'd kept safe all those years. Across the room, my wife sat rigid, her hands gripping the edge of her table like she was trying to hold herself together. Her lawyer whispered something, but she didn't. Nod didn't move. Her mother, usually a fountain of snide comments, was silent, her pearls dull under the fluorescent lights. The jury watched it all, their faces a mix of curiosity and something else. Judgment, maybe, but not aimed at me this time. Camille leaned toward me, her voice low. "This is it," she said. "The ruling's coming." I nodded, my throat tight, not from fear, but from the weight of what this moment meant. I'd walked into this fight expecting to lose, not because I was wrong, but because I'd spent so long believing I didn't matter now. With the truth spread out like bricks I'd laid myself, I felt steady, grounded. The judge cleared his throat and the room snapped to attention. His voice was calm, almost bored. As he started laying out his decision, he went through the evidence methodically: the contract, the $75,000 I'd invested, the years of contributions I'd made to the studios. He noted how my wife's team had failed to disprove the contract's validity, how their claims of clerical errors didn't hold up against the accountant's testimony, the evidence. "Is clear," he said, his eyes scanning the room. The plaintiff has a legitimate claim to 35% equity in the wellness studios, as outlined in the signed agreement. My chest loosened like I'd been holding my breath for months and could finally exhale, but he wasn't done. He ruled that my wife had to pay me 35% of all profits retroactively from the day the first studio opened to now, or grant me ownership shares in the business. If she wanted to avoid that, she could buy me out at market value, a number Camille had estimated could run into the millions given how much her empire had grown. The judge's gavel came down and the room erupted into murmurs, a low buzz that felt like static. I didn't move, didn't look at Camille or the jury or anyone. I just stared at the table, letting the words sink in. I'd want, not just a piece of her money, but the right to be seen, to have my work acknowledged. After years of being erased, my wife's lawyer stood stammering about an appeal, but the judge waved him off, already gathering his papers. She didn't stand, didn't speak. I glanced at her then and saw her face crumple, not the polished mask she'd worn all trial, but something raw, broken. Her eyes were wet, her hands shaking as she pressed them to her mouth. Part of me expected to feel satisfaction, maybe even triumph, watching her empire crack under the weight of the truth. But I didn't. I just felt quiet, like a storm had passed, leaving nothing but still air. Her mother was the first to move, storming out of the courtroom, her heels echoing like gunshots. The sound pulled me back, and I realized people were staring. Not at her, but at me. The jury, the bailiff, even the court reporter, their eyes carrying something new, respect. Maybe, or just surprised that the guy they had laughed at weeks ago had turned the tables. Camille touched my arm, her voice soft. You okay? I nodded, though I wasn't sure what okay even meant anymore. You didn't win to hurt her, she said, reading my silence. You want to heal yourself. She was right. This wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about standing up, about refusing to let my life be rewritten as a footnote in her story. I'd spent a decade building something with her, pouring my blood and sweat into every corner of those studios, and I'd walked away with nothing but callous and a broken marriage until now. As the courtroom cleared, I stayed in my seat, letting the noise fade around me. My wife's team hustled her out, her lawyer muttering about next steps. But she didn't look back. I didn't expect her to. Whatever we'd had, love, trust. A shared dream was gone long before that gavel fell. I stood finally, my legs steady, and followed Camille toward the door outside. The city hummed, oblivious to what had just happened. The air was crisp, the kind of spring day that makes you want to start over. I didn't know what came next. Not exactly the money would help, sure, but it wasn't the point. The point was, the man I'd become in that courtroom, the one who'd fought for himself. Instead of fading away. Camille walked beside me, her briefcase swinging lightly. You did good in there, she said, her smile small but real. I didn't answer, just kept walking, the weight of the wind, settling into something solid, something I could carry. I'd lost a lot, years, love, a version of myself. I'd never get back, but I'd gained something too. The truth laid bare for everyone to see, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. The air in Connecticut was different. Cleaner, quieter, like it carried less of the city's weight. I'd moved here a few months after the trial, trading my cramped Queens apartment for a small house on a street lined with oaks and picket fences. It wasn't fancy, just a 2-bedroom with a porch that creaked and a backyard big enough for a grill and a chair where I could sit with a beer and watch the stars. The settlement money had made it possible, millions more than I'd ever imagined. Wired to my account, after my wife chose to buy me out rather than share ownership. I didn't spend much of it, though didn't need to. I'd learned a long time ago that money doesn't fix what's broken inside instead. I'd started something new, something mine. I'd been sitting on the porch one night, the crickets loud and the air cool, when the idea hit me all those years. Working construction deliveries, freelance gigs, I'd learn a thing or two about hustling, about protecting what you earn. Vex gave out, hoping it was enough. I wanted to change that, so I started a side business. Nothing big, just me. helping blue-collar workers, carpenters, drivers, mechanics organize their money, set up savings, maybe even protect themselves from getting screwed over the way I almost had. I called it groundwork, a nod to the labor that built my life and theirs. I'd meet them at diners or their job sites, walking them through budgets or explaining contracts in plain English. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt right, like I was paying forward what I'd learned in that courtroom. I didn't talk about the trial much, didn't need to, but sometimes word got around a guy I'd helped with his taxes, a roofer with hands as rough as mine, looked at me one day and said, "Heard you took on some bish-shot yoga lady. That true?" I shrugged, sipping my coffee. Something like that, he nodded, like he understood more than I'd said, and went back to his paperwork. That was enough for me every now and then. I'd get texts from old employees at the studios, people I hadn't heard from in years. "I had no idea you built all that one," said a yoga instructor who'd worked the front desk back when we were still scraping by another. A maintenance guy I'd hired wrote, "You deserved better, man." I didn't reply, not because I was rude, but because I didn't know what to say. Their words were kind, but they stirred up memories. I'd rather let lie, nights painting, studio walls, mornings hauling equipment, her voice promising. We were a team that life was gone, and I wasn't chasing it anymore. My days settled into a rhythm, mornings at the hardware store where I still picked up shifts because I liked the work, afternoons meeting clients for groundwork, evenings on the porch with a book or just the quiet. I didn't need much, some groceries, a few bills, a truck that still rent fine, the settlement. Sat mostly untouched, growing in a savings account. I'd open with Camille's advice, invest it smart. She told me you've earned it. I was still figuring out what smart meant, but I wasn't in a rush for the first time in years. I had time to think, to breathe, to be. I didn't follow my wife's world anymore. Didn't check her social media or read the headlines about her studios. They were still there, still thriving from what I heard. New locations, more influencers, same glossy brand I didn't care she'd built on the foundation I'd laid. And that was enough for me to know my name was carved into those early days, whether she admitted it or not. And I didn't need her to say it out. Loud sometimes. I drive past a yoga studio, not hers, just some local place, and feel a pang. Not for her, but for the man. I'd been the one who'd believed love could outlast ambition. I didn't hate him, didn't regret him. He'd gotten me here to this quiet porch, this new life where I answered to myself one evening. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky orange, I got a call from a community center in town. They'd heard about groundwork, wanted me to give a talk to local workers about managing their money. I said yes, not because I loved speaking, but because I knew what it was like to feel invisible, to work your hands raw and still wonder if it mattered. As I hung up, I leaned back in my chair, the wood creaking under me. The stars were starting to show faint against the dusk. I thought about the trial, about standing in that courtroom, about the weight lifting when the judge's gavel fell. I'd won more than money. That day, I'd won myself back, the part I'd given away without realizing it. My phone buzzed, a text from Camille checking in like she did every few months. "You good," it read. I typed back better than good, and I meant it. I set the phone down, took a sip of my beer, and watched the sky darken. This was my life now, not perfect, not loud, but mine. And that was all I'd ever wanted. The community center smelled like old coffee and floor wax, a familiar mix that reminded me of church basements and union halls. I stood at the front of a small room, a folding table beside me, covered with handouts. I'd printed at the library simple stuff about budgets, contracts, and protecting your work. About 30 people filled the metal chairs, mostly guys like me, weathered hands, work boots, faces lined from years of labor. A few women too, one with a notepad already out, another sipping from a thermos. They'd come to hear me speak at a panel called How Not to Be Erased, a title the organizer had picked because she'd heard my story through a friend of a friend. I wasn't nervous. Not exactly, but my pulse ticked up as I adjusted the mic clip to my shirt. I'd never been one for speeches. Give me a hammer or a delivery route over a room full of eyes any day. But I'd said yes, because I knew what these people were carrying. The quiet fear that their work, their lives could be swept aside without a trace. I cleared my throat, the mic crackling, and started talking. I didn't dive into the trial right away instead. I told them about my days hauling lumber, running pizzas through Queens, designing logos on a laptop that overheated every hour. I talked about pouring every paycheck into a dream that wasn't just mine, about believing in a partnership that felt bigger than money. My voice stayed steady, the words coming easier than I'd expected. I didn't name her, didn't need to. This wasn't about her anymore. It was about the years I'd spent building something, only to watch it slip through my fingers. When the rules changed, the room was quiet, but not the bored kind of quiet. They leaned forward, nodding when I described late nights, balancing budgets or fixing leaks at the studios while my wife taught classes. I told them about the contract, how I'd found it in a storage locker, how it proved. I'd invested $75,000 and earned a 35% stake in a business that grew into millions. I didn't linger on the courtroom drama, just said I'd fought for what was mine and walked away with enough to start over. It wasn't about the money, I said, my hands resting on the table. It was about making sure my work meant something, that I wasn't just a shadow in someone else's story. A guy in the back, his cap pulled low, raised his hand. "How you know when to fight?" he asked, his voice rough. I thought about it, remembering the divorce papers hitting my hands, the notes saying I had no claim when I realized I'd given everything and was being told it was nothing. I said, "That's when you stand up, not for revenge, but for yourself." He nodded, scribbling something down. I kept going, sharing what I'd learned through groundwork, my side business, helping workers like them. I told them to keep records of their hours, their contributions, their deals, paperworks, boring until it saves you. I said, and a few chuckled. I warned them about trusting too much about love or loyalty, blinding you to your own worth. Don't wait until you're in court to realize you were the architect all along, I said, and the room went still like I'd hit a nerve. When I finished, they clapped not a roaring ovation, but a solid, real kind of applause that felt earned. People came up after shaking my hand, asking questions about contracts or savings plans. A carpenter with gray in his beard said, "I'm going to start tracking my side jobs better because of you." I nodded, feeling something warm settle in my chest, not pride but purpose. As the room emptied, I packed up my handouts, the mic still clipped to my shirt. Camille had slipped in during the Q&A, standing at the back with her arms crossed, a small smile on her face. She didn't say anything until we were outside, the night air cool against my skin. "You were good in there," she said, her voice light. "Didn't know you had it in you." I laughed, the first real laugh I'd let out in a while. Neither did I. We walked to my truck, the stars sharp above us. She didn't ask about the trial, or the settlement didn't need to. She'd been there. See me at my lowest help. Me stand tall. When I thought I'd break, "You're building something real with this," she said, nodding toward the community center. "Not just for them, for you." I didn't answer right away, just unlocked my truck and tossed my bag inside. She was right, though. Groundwork. This talk, the quiet life I'd carved out in Connecticut. It wasn't about proving anything to my wife or her mother or the world. It was about proving something to myself, that I could keep going, that I could be more than the man who'd lost everything. I drove home the road, dark and familiar, my thoughts drifting to the past, but not lingering there. The trial felt distant now, like a storm I'd weathered long ago. The money was in the bank, the studios were hers, and I was here in a life I'd chosen. I didn't hate her, didn't wish her ill. I just didn't need her anymore. Not her approval, not her empire, not her story. When I pulled into my driveway, the porch light was on, casting a soft glow over the creaky steps. I sat in the truck for a minute, letting the quiet wrap around me. This was my legacy, not a name on a building, not a headline, but a life built on my terms. I'd been erased once, but I'd written myself back in line by line, choice by choice, and as I stepped out, the stars bright above, I knew that was enough.